Our guests for this afternoon for the session entitled Top of the Pops, Deconstructing Bestsellers. This session is supported by the Hindustan Times. And on the panel we have Amish Tripathi, Ashwin Sanghi. They're in conversation with Amrita Tripathi and will be introduced by Renuka Chatterjee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Renuka Chatterjee from Westland. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon to introduce two of our authors, Ashwin Sanghi and Amish Tripathi. They are the kind of authors who can, without exaggeration, be described as God's gift to publishers. Amish is the author of the Shiva trilogy, and the total figures for the two titles currently in print, The Immortals of Melua and The Secret of the Nagas, stand at over 400,000 copies, including 20,000 copies in Hindi. Spanish rights to Melua have been sold, while a leading publisher in the UK, Quercus, have acquired world English language rights. Ashwin Sanghi is the author of two novels, The Rosible Line and Chanakya's Chant, which together have sold over 1.5 lakh copies. The Marsh Agency, a leading literary agency in the UK, is representing us abroad, and discussions are underway with publishers in the UK and the US, as well as in Italy, Germany, and other countries for the sale of foreign rights. Yet so strange are the ways of publishing that both authors started out by being rejected by every publisher to whom they sent their work, and eventually had to resort to self-publishing if they wanted their work to see the light of day. It was Amish's agent, Anuj Bari, who eventually published The Immortals of Melua under his own imprint, Tara Press. When the book went on to sell over 30,000 copies in a matter of weeks, the same book that had been turned down by publishers now had us all fighting over ourselves to get him, and we were the lucky ones. Today, Amish has been described as the Paul Coelho of the East and a people's author like Jeffrey Archer. A graduate of IIM Calcutta, Amish has been able to give up what he describes as his boring career in financial services to be a full-time writer. When Ashwin Sanghi wrote his first novel, The Rosible Line, he got so tired of knocking on publishers' and agents' doors that he eventually self-published the book under the pseudonym of Sean Higgins, a clever jumbling up of his actual name. And so it may have remained had it not been for our CEO Gautam Padmanabhan of Westland and a couple of other colleagues who read the book and found it a crackling good read. Westland went on to publish it under Ashwin's real name, and the book is going into its 6th reprint even as we speak. Needless to say, Ashwin had no such problems with Chanakya's Chant, his second book, which Westland published last year, and Chanakya has today sold over 110,000 copies. It won the 2010 Vodafone Crossword Award in the popular fiction category. A graduate of Yale University, he is an entrepreneur by day, or whenever he is not writing his next bestseller, which we are looking forward to publishing very soon. The stories of Ashwin and Amish throw up some interesting questions about publishing in India, particularly popular or mass market writing, because for the longest time, it was the literary novel that dominated Indian writing in English. Are publishers at times so out of touch with what our readers really want that authors have to resort to self-publishing, sell several thousand copies on their own, and only then get publishing houses to sit up and take notice? And even in this day of iPods and tablets and everything digital, are good old mythology and history still the richest source of inspiration for writers? Both Ashwin and Amish have drawn from these sources for their books. The Rosible Line explores the story behind the Rosa Bal Shrine in Srinagar, where the relics of Jesus Christ are supposed to be buried, while Chanakya's Chant moves from the year 340 BC to the present day, with parallel stories of Chanakya, the wily Brahmin, behind the success of the great Chandragupta Maurya, and Ganga Sagar Mishra, a Brahmin Pandit in small town India who plays kingmaker to India's most powerful woman. Amisha's Shiva trilogy is of course based on the legend of Lord Shiva. Talking to us about these and other questions is Amrita Tripathi, also a Westland author, so we have 3 straight A's from Westland here this afternoon. Although her novel, Broken News, is in a very different genre, a totally contemporary novel set in a TV newsroom. Amrita herself, as many of us who see her every day on TV, is an anchor and a newsreader with CNN IBN. So unlike Amish and Ashwin, she is drawn not from myth and legend, but on her own real-life experiences of what goes on behind the small screen. Over to you, Amrita.
Thanks, Renuka. I thought you were going to say, unlike Amish and Ashwin, her book isn't a bestseller. So that's
It is. It's getting there.
So I guess the first question we want to start with is, Amish, how do you write a bestseller?
How do you write a bestseller? You don't actually. You just write a book. The way I see it is when you're writing your book, you should care a damn about whether it's going to sell or not. You should care a damn about what critics will think of it. You should care a damn about what editors will think of it or what publishers will think of it. You should only be true to your story. Let it flow. Don't corrupt it. And refuse to change it. Care a damn about what anyone else says. If you're not convinced of the point of view being given to you, refuse to change it. I mean, when my book was being rejected around by quite a few people, one person had kindly consented that, look, we might publish the book, but you have too many philosophies in your book. So if you drop that, then apparently it'll be less boring. So I refused that, and thank God I did, because if the book had gone on to be successful like that, I wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have been happy. So when you're writing the book, I always believe you should follow your heart and not listen to anyone else. The problem, however, is publishers have a business to run, so they have money to make. So once the book has been written, then you have to become a practical, pragmatic business guy and figure out, okay, I'm not going to touch the book, but how do I sell this thing? And that time you need to be innovative. You need to figure out how to market it. You need to figure out how to position the book so that hopefully it can sell, and maybe the publisher will come back to you the next time. So that's the way I see it.
I think we'll talk a little bit about your innovative marketing as well. And Renuka, he has offered to help me with my marketing. I'm just letting you know. Ashwin, so staying true to the story you want to tell. You published your first book. You said you were forced to self-publish it actually as well, facing a lot of rejection under a pseudonym. Take us through that journey.
Well, as has often been said, that, happiness is that sensation that you feel when you observe the misery of others. So what I did was I simply started counting the number of rejections that famous authors used to get. So for example, we know that Harry Potter was rejected 12 times. We know that Gone with the Wind was rejected 38 times. We know that Stephen King was rejected 30 times. So I figured that if I've been rejected 63 times, there's no way that my book isn't a bestseller. So you convince yourself. So I would say, to answer your question, probably the answer is that make sure that you write from your heart, and then if it implies that you're going to be rejected repeatedly, then deal with that. In my book, Chanakya's Chant, I've quoted Chanakya, who says that just like you need elephants to be able to catch elephants, you need money to be able to make money. I would say the same principle applies to bestsellers. A bestseller is a book that sells because it sells. So to a very great extent, if we try and figure out the DNA of the bestseller, we'll be doing ourselves an injustice.
But that's something
I would agree completely, because see, it's very easy to blame publishers that that why can't they pick it up. But if you actually think about it, Ashwin's and my book, we had everything wrong that should be there in the book if you're hoping to sell it. There was a very nice editor who was rejecting my book, and who had rejected my book some 4 years ago. But he had had a long conversation with me and explained to me why he was rejecting my book. And he actually told me that, look, it almost seems like you've written this book to purposely alienate every single reader segment. So I was a little surprised. Okay, how have I done that? So he said, you're writing about religious philosophies, which the youth aren't interested in. Apparently they're not interested in it. Then you've got a different take on religion, which means the older religious people will not like it. And you're refusing to change your modern easy English into literary English, which means that the literati will not like it. So who in God's name are you planning to sell to? And and I told him I didn't do a market research and write the book. I just wrote the book. And it's, to be fair, however, after listening to him, even I was convinced, okay, this book, really has no hope.
But Amish,
But
if I may interrupt
you can't predict it.
You're
I
a
was
true
surprised that
secularist.
it's.
You're a true secularist. Because a secularist is someone who hates all religions equally. So, the moment you have an equality across the board.
Irritating all readers, absolutely.
Coming back to the question that you asked me regarding the journey, honestly speaking, I must tell you that when I wrote the Rosabal line and I started receiving in rejections, and some of them were not very pretty, let me tell you. I distinctly remember receiving one letter which said that the book is good, but I wish it had stopped on page 10. So you have to go through that process. But I was determined in my mind. 2007, I self-published the book. It went on to Amazon, began to be sold as a typical self-published novel. I was very lucky that Gautam Padmanabhan at Westland happened to pick up the book. And in 2008, he said, listen, Ashwin, why haven't we published this? And I said, well, I've been rejected by virtually every publisher that there is. I think the only thing that Gautam insisted on was that he said, you've used this pseudonym, Sean Higgins. And look, there's going to be a basic problem because, if a reporter wants to come in and meet you and he suddenly expects to meet Mr. Sean Higgins and then he finds a fat, pot-bellied Marwadi businessman sitting out there, that's not Sean Higgins. So there's a bit of a problem there. So we figured that, we needed to get to the real name. But honestly, after that, there was no looking back. And what made that book work or what made Chanakya's chant work, I have no idea. So I think to a certain extent we are trying to dissect what makes us tick, but I don't know whether we can.
I think you look like a Sean, frankly. I mean, I buy that. But I do want to ask you, because what you both also have in common is, until a very short while ago, people tended to be very coy about self-publishing. No one wanted to admit to it. Also when it comes to not writing in literary English, there's a huge, there's a huge gap between that and what you're doing, which is essentially to say, I will write the way I speak, and that's what I'm going to do. So for both of you, I mean, you're no longer shy or coy about these things, or even to talk about marketing and sales.
Look, as far as English is concerned, everyone has their own passions, okay? There are some people who are passionate about food. I'm not passionate about food, but I'm not going to judge someone who's passionate about food. There are some people who are passionate about language. Fair enough. And there are some people who are passionate about philosophy and religion and knowledge. I'm not really passionate about language. For me, it's only a means to an end. I'm passionate about knowledge and philosophy. So, which means that, an Amitav Ghosh, which is written in literary English, but is a beautiful, is a wonderful writer, and his Ibis trilogy is absolutely brilliant. It's not just a story, it has deep philosophies. I'm going to read it. I don't care if it's written in literary English. And the autobiography of a yogi, it might be written in English, which a literary person might sniff at, but I don't care because the philosophies are wonderful. So I'm going to read it. So I'm not passionate about language. I'm passionate about philosophies and knowledge. And I will not judge someone who is passionate about language. That's their passion. But it's not my passion. So that's the way I see it. And since I'm not passionate about it, I should also be respected. And it's also, I guess there are a lot of authors out here. If any publisher rejects you, care a damn, just go ahead and self-publish. Okay? Yeah. The other thing is, in my mind, self-publishing is not just about publishers rejecting their notion of quality. It's a question of freedom of expression, which our constitution guarantees. Which means you have the right to make your voice heard. Someone else has the right to not listen to it. Okay, that's fair. But no one has the right to tell you that you cannot speak your mind. That's
I'm going to come back to what you said irritates you when people just presume they know all about you. But in terms of also when it comes to language, not really knowing how the market clicks. That's something publishers, I mean, everyone after Harry Potter was looking for the next Harry Potter, as opposed to maybe being open to what could possibly be.
Amrita, there was I can't remember, I think it was Somerset Maugham who said that there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. And that's precisely the point where I started. I didn't know the first thing about writing. I hadn't written a word, except for high school essays. But other than that, honestly, I hadn't written anything which could remotely be considered even as a short story. So to that extent, the only exposure that I had was to the reading habit, which had come from my grandfather, who used to send me 1 book every week. And that is what sort of got me hooked to the idea of reading. I think I was very lucky when I wrote the Rosabal line, not knowing how to write a book. Because if I knew how to write a book, probably I wouldn't have done half the things that I actually did with the Rosabar line. I wouldn't have taken half the liberties that I took when I wrote the book. So I think to a certain extent when I came out with Chanakya's chant and I read the Rosabar line once again and Chanakya's chant once again side by side, I'm still in love with the Rosabar line because I knew much less. It was unpolluted. I wasn't trying to be a bestseller. By the time that I wrote Chanakya's chant, I was trying to be a bestseller. So there is a huge difference, in the strategies. Second, I believe that at the end of the day, whether it is Amish or whether it is Ashwin Sanghi or whether it is anyone else, ultimately we are a country of stories. For thousands and thousands of years, we have lived on the basis of oral storytellers, village bards as they were, moving from one village to another. We didn't have written language for the longest time. So at the end of the day, we are all storytellers. We are a country of stories, mythologies, myths, history. And so at the end of the day, if someone asks me, Ashwin, how would you like to be remembered after you have written, let's say, 10 books? I would say that I don't want to be called a writer. I don't want to be called an author. I hope that people remember me as a storyteller.
You're very passionate about the story you're trying to tell. You've become a Shiv Bhakt, we understand, in the process of researching and writing this book. And as I was telling you, one of my friends said, I have to bring this up, that you've made a lot of people fall in love with Shiv the man, she said, as opposed to what they've seen or read over the years. Just take us through that angle of it. You're right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was an atheist till 8-9 years ago. Though I grew up in a very religious family. My grandfather was a priest in Banaras. Both my parents were very religious. So most of what I know of mythology and religion and our philosophies, I learned from my family. I learned it the old-fashioned way, through Shruti, through listening. However, I was an atheist. So I guess I didn't approach those stories as gospel. I just approached them as interesting stories which teach you things. And all that remained in the back of my mind, to come out when it was meant to. Also for me, I guess the process of becoming a believer has to do also with the fact that I'm still stunned that I've actually written an entire book, 2 entire books. Because just like Ashwin, I had written absolutely nothing before the Immortals of Meluha. Not even a short story in school, not even essays. My essays were terrible. I was more of a sports guy in school. All I'd written was some poetry. I've spoken about it many times. All those poems were terrible. Nobody liked it. Only my girlfriend liked it. She's this very sweet girl who's my wife now. And I always say the reason I married her is because she didn't laugh at my poems. So, and I had written nothing, absolutely nothing. I didn't have one creative bone in my body. And the fact that this story just came to me has just stunned me so much that I couldn't explain where it was coming from. But I kind of just sit down to write and it just flows. And if I try and control that flow, if I try and make the story go in a direction that I want, the flow stops. If I don't control the story and just go with the flow, it actually just comes in a flood. It's almost like I have to approach the story with the humility of a witness, not with the arrogance of. For me, that thing just slowly, as I discovered more and more of Shiva, it changed my attitude to life. I became a much calmer person. I was one of those typical MBA banker types. I was hyper competitive. I used to shout and scream a lot. I'm sure my team, must have hated me in my corporate life. I'm much calmer today. I'm a believer, and he's just changed my life completely. He's changed it by 180 degrees. I realize how lucky I am. What a wonderful wife I have. What a wonderful family I've been blessed with. So I guess I became a believer slowly. As the story emerged more and more, I became more and more of a believer. It wasn't one sexy moment, of a bright flash of light and, oh, I'm a believer now. Sadly, it wasn't like that. I know that'll make good press, but it wasn't. It kind of just happened slowly. And I discovered more and more faith in him. And as far as he being cool in the book is concerned, I mean, I think even as a god, no disrespect to any other god, but Lord Shiva is a very cool god. Yeah, no, really, there's no other term for it. Okay, one of my readers had written into me, a teenager. He said that he used to think Lord Shiva was his grandmother's god, and now he thinks he is the dude of the gods. And I'm actually not surprised by that term, because if you think about him as God, he He's a brilliant dancer. He's a fierce warrior. He smokes pot. He's passionately in love with his wife. He's a one-woman man and he's passionately in love with her. He treats his wife with respect. He holds the children in his lap. If you see even in the mythical representations of Lord Shiva and Parvati ji, she doesn't sit at his feet. She sits next to him, shoulder to shoulder, as an equal. He is a very modern, relaxed, cool god. So I don't think it was much of a change to portray him as that.
But they did have some issues in the traditional sense, but I guess any relationship.
No, but I'll tell you, in those issues, see, those are normal, man. I mean, I love my wife desperately, but there are regrettably many times, almost 90% of the times, when she doesn't listen to me. Okay, usually she's right, so it's good that she doesn't listen to me. Okay, but there were, even with Lord Shiva and Parvati ji, when Parvati ji would not listen to Lord Shiva, he wouldn't punish her for disobeying him. He would continue to love her and he would continue to respect her. And that's what a marriage is, right? I mean, you don't listen to each other all the time, but you respect each other.
So from the Duel of the Gods and the story that kind of shows you how you pick Chanakya as well is interesting. You're saying that this is one of the truly grey characters of ours. And again, you split this into two eras.
That's right. Well, you know, I always love stories where there isn't a very clear distinction between good and bad, where the characters can be partly good and they can be partly bad. They're grey characters, and that makes it so much more interesting, because till the very end you're wondering, oh, is he the goodie or is he the baddie? So I like that sort of storytelling. Chanakya's chant was actually something that came to me when in 2009, when I was sitting and watching the entire TV drama of the UPA elections. General elections had played out, the UPA had come into power, Karunanidhi had arrived in Delhi, he was at Sonia Gandhi's house, someone was putting a shawl on him, there were talks happening about seat sharing, not seat sharing, cabinet posts. And well, by the evening, Karunanidhi ji had already returned to Chennai, because he wasn't happy with the deal that was being offered. And I thought to myself, my God, this is such a messy process of creating a government. Was government creation always so messy? Were things very different? We always have a tendency to look back nostalgically at times and say, well, you know, times must have been better. But honestly speaking, when you read history, times weren't better. They were pretty much the same. And so I found this entire fascinating character of Chanakya, who 2,300 years ago played the role of a Machiavelli and created Chandragupta to be the emperor of India. And I thought to myself, what in case there was a modern day Chanakya today, in modern day India, playing exactly the same role. So the book is written as two parallel stories. There is the Chanakya story, which is based pretty much on history. And then there is a modern day story of a Brahman, Pandit Gangasagar Mishra, who's born in Kanpur, and picks up a girl from the slum and says, I will make you Prime Minister. And so these two stories are moving in parallel. And I was just fascinated with being able to explore those parallels. Because, you know, there has been there's the old, from the Art of War, which says that, you know, politics is nothing else but war without bloodshed. And honestly speaking, what you realize when you look at these two eras is that people have changed, places have changed, props have changed, but human nature has not changed. Battle strategies have not changed. So the game is pretty much exactly the same. And that is what fascinated me and prompted me to write about Chanakya.
The game is on, very much so. Now you both also have movie deals. Let's talk about this, because everyone always presumes, and it has been happening, once you have a very good a book that's working well, how do you translate it into a movie? I know you don't particularly want to be involved in the script writing process. Are you involved in the script, the movie? Are you going to have a say in who plays what?
Well, I mean, I have creative consultation, but obviously there's going to be a script writer who'll put the script together. It cannot be made exactly as per the book, because from what I've been told, apparently one page translates into 1 minute on screen. My books are kind of long. So it's 400 pages. You can't have a 400-minute movie. It's 7 hours, 8 hours. That's kind of a human rights violation. So it has to be edited. There's going to be a script that will be made out of it. Yeah, the task at hand is to make the script and to appoint a director. That's what Karan Johar, who has bought the rights from me, will be working on.
You already have a movie trailer before your second book came out. You had this very cool sort of preview. Tell us about how you did that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the idea came from, some friends of mine who'd read the book. They said that apparently my book has a very visual feel. Interestingly, that's actually how the book comes to me. It kind of gets downloaded as a movie. I kind of see pictures, I feel the emotions of the characters, and I just describe what I see. That's how I write. So one of my friends suggested that how about if we give that feel as a teaser to readers, make a trailer film, and let them feel what the story is about in a short 1 minute. Then if they're interested, they'll go and pick up a book. So that was the idea. So what we did was, this uses roughly the same kind of technique that was used to make 300. So the movie 300. So we had models, we had rough sets set up, and they were shot in big studios with blue chroma screens, across the wall. And then what we did was we shot them, and then we replaced that with special effects, with my imagination of what the city looked like, and in those days. And I thought the trailer film worked quite well. These guys were kind enough to pay for it. And we showed that at multiplexes, and I thought that was an interesting way to promote the book.
That was along with the time that Ravan was released as well. So as a marketing tool, it worked as well, right, effectively. You also have a video up on your website, and your book's also going to be made into a movie.
Well, let me answer the second question first. Yes, we created a trailer, but the trailer was incidental because the title of the book is Chanakya's Chant. So at the center of the book, the focus of the book is a chant, a Sanskrit shlok. And what I wanted was basically to take that Sanskrit shlok and have it recited in a way where an average reader could actually go back onto the internet, download the chant, and actually listen to it and get a feel of how it would actually sound. We got, and the brief to him was that use the chant in a 4-minute track. And in that 4-minute track, the first 2 minutes should be completely ancient, only using a veena, nothing else, only ancient instruments, and evoke the spirit of 340 BC. And the next 2 minutes, given the fact that we have a parallel story, which is in the modern day, we transcend into rock fusion, where the same chant is then recited, but in a very contemporary and modern way. So at the video, the visuals which went with the chant were incidental because we had the chant to be used. As regards the movie, when I wrote this book, I didn't realize it, but I had written it very, very visually. For example, some of the chapters in a book, some of the scenes in the book last for less than half a page, and then the scene changes. And that's primarily because I saw it as something which was rather visual. Everything needed to be described. If I was talking about ancient Magad, then I wanted to have a scene in which I could actually describe how the wood fires burned on the streets. What were the oil lamps like? If you went into a king's pleasure palace, then what would the room have looked like? For me, those are the bits which evoke that entire historical effect. And when UTV, a bunch of people at UTV read the book, they felt that this book lends itself to a screenplay. So I sold the rights to UTV about 4 or 5 months ago, and currently they are in the process of scripting it. I must tell you, however, that I have consciously chosen to stay away from the scripting process. I have read lots of good books that did not work out well as films. And I've also seen some very, very good films which weren't great books to start with. So I genuinely believe that the skills required in bringing that to celluloid is very, very different. So the further I remain away from that, probably the better are the chances of the product being good. Having said that, however, I have told UTV that wherever you require me for creative input, I will be available. But I'm not going to trust myself in that direction.
So I'm sure like a dream role for them as well, just to have an author who's not. I want to ask you both also about the kind of reactions you've gotten. I'll start with you. What is one of the nicest reactions you've gotten from a fan?
I was telling you about the storytelling bit. For me, the critical element in a book is that if you pick it up, then do you want to read it to the end? Do you want to turn the page? Someone sent me an email saying that I have a problem because I didn't go to work today because I started reading your book last night and I was reading it till 3 a.m. in the morning. By the time that I finished reading it, I was too tired to go to work. So in the process, I ended up getting into a lot of trouble because today was a critical day. But I just wanted you to know. And I said, well, God bless you. But I said, that's the nicest compliment that anyone has ever paid me. Because it doesn't matter to me whether people tell me that your writing is great or not, but your skill at holding the attention of a reader right to the last page, for me, that's critical.
As a storyteller. And for you?
Yeah, there was, Mrs. Tharoor is here. She told me, of the situation of a friend of hers apparently, who'd gone to Chennai for a meeting, who'd gone in his private jet, and he'd gone specifically for a meeting, apparently. And he was reading the book, and apparently he landed out there, and he had the plane parked, and he stayed in the plane, and he continued reading, and he missed his meeting, and he came back in the, in the afternoon without doing that meeting. That's what Ms. Tharoor told me. I thought that was quite
hard to
quite
top
nice.
that one. She's nodding that it's true.
One of the feedback that touched me very deeply was an email I got from Kashmir from a gentleman called Bashir Manzar, and I almost had tears in my eyes when I got that email. He wrote into me saying that he was an atheist, and however he felt inspired on reading my book. My book is on a Hindu god, and he said that he was so inspired on reading the book that he wanted to explore his own religion, Islam, as well. And he said that because there is so much beauty in religious thought, which sadly gets lost in a lot of unnecessary noise. And he told me a line, because in my book, Lord Shiva enters India through Kashmir. And he said, look at the sad state of the state which the Lord's feet touched first. And he said, inshallah, Allah and Shiva will bless this land and we will come out of this mess. And that email really touched me. And I think that shows the beauty of India. I don't just get emails from Hindus. I get emails from Muslims, from Christians, from Sikhs, from Buddhists who've read the book and they like it and they feel inspired.
And I think you also want to emphasize this because you're saying what really annoys you is when people just presume that because you've written about Shiva that you are some sort of Hindu fundamentalist.
Yeah, that's. That does happen at times, and it's kind of sad because actually I think if you go deep into India's past, religiosity and liberalism have actually never been in conflict in India. If you are actually deeply religious, you will automatically be liberal, and which is why the Bhakti movement is so huge in India, which is why the Sufi movement is so massive in India, because Indians actually think that way. I'm a very proud Hindu. I worship Lord Shiva every morning. I do a Mahamrityunjay Jap every morning. I visit a Shivji temple every Monday. And in my puja room at home, of course I have an idol of Shivji in the center, and I have other Hindu gods. But I also have a picture of the Kaaba. I have a picture of Mother Mary. I have a picture of Jesus Christ. I have a picture of Zarathustra Ji, the Zoroastrian prophet. I have a picture of Gautam Buddha. And I worship all of them every morning. And I don't think actually that I'm doing anything new. I think this is the Indian way. We have sadly imported a definition of secularism from abroad, which ends up meaning either equal distance or equal hatred of all religions. And actually the Indian definition of secularism is different. The Indian definition of secularism is equal love of all religions. That I will be deeply proud of my religion, but I will respect and love every other religion as well. That is the Indian way.
And do you think that's something you obviously agree with as well, especially at a time that we seem to be seeing rising intolerance? Have we forgotten this basic?
When I started writing the Rosabal line, I was very worried. What would be the reaction of people to the fact that I talk about a grave which contains the mortal remains of Jesus Christ? Partly, of course, there is a medieval saint who's already buried at Rosabal. So there is already a certain element of dispute around the tomb itself. There was also the concern as to what would be the impression of the conservative right within the Christian community, for example, regarding the fact that one says that, well, he was buried there, which means, in other words, probably the crucifixion and the resurrection may not have happened. But I must tell you, in so many years after having published the book, I've been delighted by the sort of emails and tweets that I receive day on day. none of them so far have ever come back to me and said, why have you written what you have written? It has always been a question that, well, if this happened, then what is the explanation? People want to go deeper in order to find out as to what was the reason for you writing something. But it's not with a desire to simply contradict for the heck of contradicting, which is what I find so refreshing about our country. We talk about a lot of the religious hate. We talk about, currently around the festival there have been so many issues that have cropped up. But I don't know, I think Amish's experience is probably similar, because both of us could easily be hauled up for taking religious icons as they were, and making stories out of them. But all that we've tried to do is basically present a slightly different perspective.
It's a new reader. There's a cat coming up on stage.
I never realized I had such a following.
Okay, so before we break for questions, I just want to ask you both, because we're talking about religious tolerance and freedom of expression, what your opinions are on what's going on with the Salman Rushdie controversy. Do you want to go first?
If I may, because I'm a deeply religious person, right? And which means that I respect all religions. But I think Maulana Wahiduddin Khan put it perfectly on how this issue should be treated. And he quoted from the Quran and said that what does the Quran tell us to do? And he said that actually Salman Rushdie should be invited here for a debate, and the people who feel hurt should put their point of view across in a rational, logical manner, and they should debate with him. And if they convince him, well and good, hopefully, of their point of view. Since I'm a religious person, I like to see respect towards religion. If they don't, then they should, with respect, agree to disagree. And that is actually what all religions tell us to do. If you read the Rig Veda, there's a wonderful Sanskrit slok in there which says, Ekam Sata Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, which means that the truth is one, but sages know it as many. That the same truth can be interpreted differently in different ways. And there is no need for rancor if someone else has a different interpretation. Indulge in an open debate. And I agree with what the Maulana said.
Dialogue is key.
I think, honestly speaking, I believe that you already have an environment where freedom of speech is automatically counteracted by the freedom not to listen. So, to a very great extent, I find the debates around, in fact, not only the Salman Rushdie issue, but even the current issue surrounding the internet and the desire of governments around the world. It's not only happening in India. SOPA is a key issue in the US also. I find this very strange, because some of the greatest thinking, some of the greatest works have emerged because of the fact that we created that environment for those things to emerge. Minus the internet, I think, for example, I wouldn't have read half of the downloaded books that I downloaded on the internet and read. I was not a person who spoke fluent Sanskrit. I had a smattering of knowledge, but I used to regularly utilize online resources for translations. So it was all of those tools which made it possible for me to be able to produce the work that I did. I think we are going in a completely wrong direction by stifling freedom of speech, because at the end of the day, that is that one single spark which will keep us active, which will keep us imagining, which will keep the creative spirit alive. We are doomed to a miserable monotony of the word which is so-called acceptable. If you and I are agreeing all the time, then one of us is irrelevant in that discussion.
I have a feeling it's me, because of the millions of followers. No, you're right. And of course, the freedom, that includes the freedom to dissent, the freedom to exchange ideas. I think we definitely want to bring in audience questions, because I know, but let's get the mics out. Hands up. Okay, there's a gentleman here.
A friend of mine...
Could you, do you mind if I ask you to introduce yourself?
my name is Raghav.
Hi Raghav, go ahead.
And my friend Rashi, I think she wrote to you as well. She had spoken about how how the book, even though it might not be a masterpiece, it actually reached out and grabbed her at a consciousness level, or a subconscious, or whatever. You know, the way you've spoken about channeling the book. And on the other hand, you also speak about, you know, the benefit of having your ancestors who were deeply into religious practices and the traditions. So there are two things here. You have the facts somewhere, and you have this channeling happen to you. Could you take us specifically through how that actually happened? So you sat down one day, after, you know, being a financial person, and then how did that switch happen? And how did it actually really happen to you?
Okay, see, firstly, I believe, you know, if I compare writing a book to cooking a meal, for example, right? You can't cook a meal if you don't have the ingredients, right? You have to have the ingredients. But someone has to give you that talent to be able to cook. So in writing a book, the ingredients is the knowledge, right? The knowledge of our myths, the knowledge of our religion, the knowledge of philosophy, and that's like the ingredients. And for me, you know, I should read up as much as I can. I should listen to my elders as much as I can, so that I can pick up all that knowledge. That's what I attempt to do, right? So that the knowledge is there somewhere in the back of the mind. But just because you have the ingredients, it doesn't mean that a meal can be prepared, right? So as far as converting that knowledge into a story is concerned, I just leave it up to him. He just somehow just pieces it together. I just follow the flow, right? That's how it works. How the book began was, it began as a pure philosophy. You know, some 8-9 years ago, my family and I, we were watching TV. We all know that for Hindus, gods are called devas and demons are called asuras. What many of us don't know is that for the ancient Persians, the Zoroastrian Persians, not the Islamic Persians, gods were called ahuras and demons were called daivas. Okay? It's the exact opposite of the Indian pantheon. It even goes to the extent, for example, that Indra is the king of the gods amongst Hindus, right? He is a demon in the Zoroastrian Persian pantheon. So my family, and it triggered an interesting debate in our family, where the ancient Indians and the ancient Persians had met. We'd probably be calling each other evil, right? Because my God is your demon, your God is my demon, hell, you must be evil, right? Now, the obvious question is, who'd be right? The obvious answer is neither, right? It is just two different points of view. Neither of them are evil. Which then gives rise to the next obvious question. If neither of them are evil, then what is evil? You know, and so a philosophy occurred to me as an answer to that, and I share it with my family. They said, dude, it's nice, you know, try and write it down. But of course, a pure philosophy thesis is kind of boring. You know, so there was a good idea that, you know, try and convert it into a story. And so that's how the book emerged. The story, you know, kind of started emerging to convey that philosophy. If I'm writing a book on the destroyer of evil, who better to be the hero? If I'm writing a book on evil, who better to be the hero than the destroyer of evil himself?
Hello. My question is to Mr. Sanghi, who wrote on a most controversial subject, Roosevelt Line. I am Rama Pandey, a filmmaker and writer, and I am married to a Kashmiri Muslim, and I know what he's talking about. My question and my partly advice also, when you say, which Amish also said, that his book was translated in Hindi, and that is why it was sold in greater number. Now the controversy is, उस कब्र के नीचे आखिर है क्या? हजरत ईसा है या कोई medieval saint है?
Correct.
इसके चलते आज की तारीख तक, Mrs. Tharoor would agree with me, who knows the truth, ताला लगा हुआ है.
That's true.
किताब पढ़ने वाले लोग और हैं. Those who read the books are different.
Of course.
And those who lock the grave are different.
Absolutely.
So I would like your book to be translated into a language of a commoner, so they understand what is the thought line behind and why this Roosevelt Shrine is very pious, and it could be for both the religions.
Absolutely. No, what you have mentioned is a very, very valid issue. I had written the Roosevelt Line in 2007, and in 2008, when Westland published it, the book happened to be covered in the Lonely Planet Guide, and the Roosevelt Shrine was mentioned as the place which was covered in my novel as the possible resting place of Jesus Christ. In the process, there were so many people who went to the shrine that apparently the trustees of the shrine took a decision to actually shut it down, 2 visits. The controversy actually to a certain extent arises because we know that there is a medieval saint, Nasruddin, who is buried there, and which is a typical Muslim burial, which is a north-south burial. But there is another body which is supposedly buried under the primary body. And that burial is not a north-south burial, it is an east-west burial, which obviously implies, and given the fact that the remains are supposedly dated back to 112 AD, it was far before the advent of Islam. So to that extent, there are several people who have attempted to find out as to what could be a possible way of proving who is buried there. वो 112 AD में कौन वहाँ पर दफनाया गया था? A very close friend who also helped me with the initial research for the Rosabal line is a lady by the name of Suzanne Olson. And she is an American researcher. And the object of her research was to dig up the bones from the Rosabal shrine, as well as to dig up the bones from another site which is known as Mari. आपने शायद सुना होगा नाम. It is on the Indo-Pakistan border. And the commonly held belief is that when Jesus Christ was traveling from Jerusalem all the way to India, his mother, who had become rather aged, she died on the Indo-Pakistan border, and there is in fact a British watchtower which is on that location. So her intention was to basically be able to do a DNA match between the two. Unfortunately, before she could even start the exercise, she was hounded out. So I think there are certain things which unfortunately in our country arouse very, very strong passions. I think this is an issue which probably is never going to get resolved because it will have passionate views on both sides of the argument. But yes, I do take your point as far as translations are concerned. As we speak, the Rosabal line is currently being translated into 4 other Indian languages, which I expect that probably during the course of this year, the book will become available in those languages.
I have the mic over here. Sorry. So just, I wanted to ask, Amish, you recommended private publishing and self-publishing. That's great. But we need, as authors, the marketing might of a publishing house, without which, a book will never see the light of day. That's the second point I wanted to make was, okay, Salman couldn't come to the conference. But what is more unforgivable is that the conference organizers have thrown 4 authors out. And we are continuing this conference as if nothing happened. And I think that is a bigger shame.
Okay. I have to say that they're saying they were advised legally to leave, so I'm just going to, you can answer that as you see fit, but.
I'll answer the first one. As far as marketing is concerned, Facebook and Twitter are free media. And they've really democratized the world. And once e-readers take off and people can just download e-books, there is a genuine fear amongst publishers that they may get disintermediated. So it's up to an author if he wants to push it. Okay? And of course, I'm not denying that having a publisher obviously makes life a lot easier because then you can just focus on writing, and someone else is doing that job. I'm a slightly anal and deeply involved guy, so I get involved in every aspect of the book. So I harass them a lot on every single aspect of marketing and everything else. But not every author might want to do that. Some authors would just be happy only writing. So in that case, yes, a publisher helps. But you don't desperately need it in the age of Facebook and Twitter.
Just to add to what Amish said, I think there are now enough living examples around the world. Take an Amanda Hawking, for example, where you have close to around 1 million copies having been sold across her titles without any traditional publisher involved. In Japan, there is an author who solely publishes novels which are available on cell phones. So you get an installment of the novel every day, and that is downloaded 12 million times per day. So we are talking of technology having democratized the entire business of writing and disseminating writing. So I would seem to agree with Amish that probably at the time when we started out with our first books, that truth held. But I don't know whether it does today.
We have a question there, but I just want to ask, anyone else hold up their hand so we can send the mic for the next. Okay, there's a couple there. Okay, but
My name is Vivek Atre and I'm the author of a book called Move On Bunny, which has sold a few thousand copies, but not a few lakh copies like you guys. So I just want to know how much of your own personal time did you spend promoting the book? I mean, and what all did you do personally every day? Did you do it full time or were you doing it part time, promoting the book?
Look, I work in phases. So I have a writing phase and I have a marketing phase. And in my writing phase, unless I committed to a speech or talk, many months back, I don't do any marketing. So I'm in my writing phase right now, but I committed to the Jaipur Lit Fest a few months back. So, so I honored this and, a few other Lit Fests. But otherwise, I don't do much marketing activity. But once I enter the marketing phase, at least my view is the author has to be closely involved in every detail. So I write the marketing vision document, okay, for the book, which I discuss with the publishers. I drive the marketing strategy. I make the marketing plans. What are the things that we're going to do? And I am closely involved in every single detail of the marketing strategy. Why is that? Because there are some red lines that an author will have that. Yes, you may want to market, but for example, you're not allowed to do this. Like, I am very, very clear. That I do not want to use controversy as a marketing tool. There are, and that does get used at times, but I'm very, very clear on that. So, I know one of the PR agencies who we interviewed had actually suggested that stupid idea to me. We can arrange, 10 people to come and, do this and, you don't need more people for a TV camera. And I was horrified. Okay. So, unless you are involved, no one else can, draw the red lines. For me, if I generate controversy, I'm insulting Lord Shiva. If I do that, that's the way I look at it, right? So I am closely involved in every single detail of the marketing activity once I'm in the marketing phase, which is around, say, 2 or 3 months. Once the book has been launched. But once it's on its way, then you can kind of step back and and it'll sell by itself. But in those 2-3 months, I don't. Any writing, I'm completely involved in the marketing activity. I harass them a lot.
I would agree with Amish. The only difference is that, of course, he has very distinct phases. He has a writing phase, he has a marketing phase, whereas in Ashwin Sanghi's case, he's most of the time phased out. So, I don't know which phase I happen to be in at that given moment of time. I have a parallel career. I work as a businessman during the day. I write at night. And very often I end up getting up late in the morning because I've been writing till 2 a.m. Marketing is not as well structured as what Amish does, but at the same time I have tried to build a one-on-one rapport with my readers. So I'm very, very active on Twitter. I'm extremely active on Facebook. I make sure that when I receive an email, then I set myself a deadline that any email gets responded to within 48 hours. So the idea is basically that there is a one-on-one relationship. I had a very interesting instance recently where I went to launch the book of a young lady at the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. And she was one person who had written to me just when she had read the Rosabal line, the first edition, I think, sometime 2007. And she told me that this was a mind-blowing book and I was completely blown away by the philosophies that you have presented. And then she wrote to me a full 4 years later, saying that, your book inspired me to actually write a manuscript of my own, and I have now been published. Will you please come and launch it? And there was no way that I could say no. I went. So those are the sort of relationships that you build up, and as has been very correctly said, that at the end of the day, the destination is not important, the journey is so much more important. So I'm having a lot of fun while doing this. I'm having fun being here. And so whether that ends up selling another couple of thousand books, inshallah, who knows? But this is more fun.
There's a question back there.
Hi, question for Amish.
Hey, your name, yeah, dude?
Yeah, my name is Siddharth Kaushik.
Hi, Siddharth. Go ahead.
We know that you're a big follower of Lord Shiva, and even I believe the deity Lord Shiva very well, and I can narrate stories about him forever. But if given a chance, like it's my personal affair now, my God, my life, my God. Now, if somebody asks you to talk about a different religion or to say about any other God, will you be able to deliver that same audacity which you did for Lord Shiva, or is just that again a personal affair for you as well in terms of Lord Shiva?
Well, I mean, I am a Shiv Bhakt, yes. but I've been blessed with various other stories. I have my version of the Ramayana, my version of the Mahabharata, my version of Lord Manu's story, my version of Lord Rudra's story, a story set in ancient Turkey, a story set on Emperor Akbar, who I think was not just one of the greatest emperors of India, he was one of the greatest emperors the world has ever seen. I have various stories in my mind. They are on various other gods. I know it might sound like a cliche, but I genuinely believe that I don't pick the story picks me. And if it comes to me, I'll write it. And if it is on other gods, then so be it, because I have stories on other gods. And inshallah, I'll write all of them. Let's see where life takes me.
There's a question here in front.
Hi, Amish. Yeah.
Hi.
I'm Trishna.
Hi, Trishna.
You an atheist and I'm an agnostic. I just want to ask you, you said something very interesting about very deeply religious people being very liberal, but also very deeply religious people are very fanatic. Where does one draw, there is a very slim line, would you agree? And
the point is, what is liberalism? That has to be understood. Many times it gets confused in India, sometimes in the US, as being left of center. That means liberalism. I don't think that's what liberalism actually means. What liberalism means is that I might have one point of view and you might have a completely opposite point of view, and I will respect your right to have your point of view. That's what liberalism is. Right? And if you get truly religious, I believe that automatically happens. Let me tell you a story. There's Ajmer Sharif is close by. I love that place. Many times when I've come to Jaipur, I've gone out there. And I'd met a mullah once out there, and he is, exactly like how you would expect a mullah to be, beard, skull cap, pajama ending a little bit above the ankle. And he told me, and I asked him, that what do you think is the final truth? Because we have two opposing, options. And then he told me that there is one final truth for me, there's one final truth for you. And the Lord comes to us in different ways because we are different people. And he told me a story to kind of convey this to me, and I'd love to share this story with you. You heard of Rumi, I assume, right? I'm one of the most brilliant philosophers ever. He can change your life with 5 lines, right? Now, there was a gentleman called Shams, a dervish, called Shams, who's supposed to have made Jalaluddin Rumi into Rumi, right? He was, so Shams had spoken of this story, apparently. That's what I was told by the mullah, that once a man died, right, and his soul, his ruh, came out of the body, right, and because it's a soul, it's free, and it flew away, right, and it flew higher and higher, beyond the clouds, beyond the earth, beyond the solar system, and higher, beyond the Milky Way galaxy, beyond the multiple galaxies in the universe, and beyond the multiple universes that exist, till the soul reached the source of light, right, and the soul went, bowed its head out there and asked him, there's this tiny, small, insignificant little planet, far, far away called Earth. Does it really matter to you what religion people follow out there? And you know what God answered? I don't care. What God said is, whatever path you follow, they will all end with me. And I actually believe that. And this was told to me by a mullah at Ajmer Sharif.
We have time for one final question. So, where's the mic? In the front? This girl in the front?
Hi, my name is Kritika. I'm a writer and a yoga teacher. You talk a lot about Shiva, and being a yoga teacher, I have studied the philosophies of Shiva as the Adi Guru of yoga. Now, in your books, you talk about marijuana, that Shiva smokes pot, and I think a lot of people find that really cool. But my question really is this. Shiva was the Adi Guru of yoga. Because he was a yogi, the marijuana did not essentially affect him. My concern is that readers reading your book would find it encouraging to smoke pot after reading your book. And they would not be yogis.
Stoned.
Okay. I'm assuming you built it from the Yoga Sutra, your yoga thing, from Patanjali's. Okay. Look, yes, I agree. There is a form of worship for Lord Shiva where you drink bhang. There are times when I have, smoked marijuana. But is that something I would recommend? Hell no. Okay. It is, okay, there's actually some research that I said, and you've heard of the third eye, right? And there's a concept that the third eye actually refers to the pineal gland, which is something which regenerates your body. And apparently what marijuana does is it activates the pineal gland. That's what activates your senses. And that's why, for example, I was a singer in the band at my B school at IIM Calcutta. And if you kind of, if you smoked a joint before singing, it kind of heightened the beats a bit, so you ended up singing a little better. Now, the point I'm trying to communicate is that actually if you understand spirituality, your pineal gland gets activated without the marijuana. And remember, the marijuana might activate your pineal gland, which makes you feel happy and spiritual, but it destroys your body. So over the long term, it's not good for you, right? Just like sugar gives you an energy rush, but if you keep eating, tons of sugar every day, you're going to die of diabetes, right? But if you experience spirituality, you will find your pineal gland activated, the third eye activated, without the need for marijuana, and that is the route to go for, because then your body can remain healthy. So anyone who's thinking of smoking marijuana, please don't. Try and practice spirituality. It actually activates your third eye.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you. Thank you both very much, and Renuka, of course, and a wonderful audience as well.
Please join me in thanking Amish Tripathi, Ashwin Sanghi and Amrita Tripathi, along with Renuka Chatterjee. And that session was supported by the Hindustan Times. There will be some signings in the author tent if you would like to go over to the Full Circle bookstore now. The authors will then appear at the book signing area.